Now that we implemented this first example, this first demo, I wanna introduce another new concept which is not related to the DOM, but which is important in JavaScript in general, which is a bit more advanced, and which therefore fits perfectly into this section as well. And this concept is about variables and a variation of those variables called constants. Now, we did learn about variables already in the last course section, and we saw plenty of examples for variables in action. Just in case you forgot it, variables are these labeled data containers which we use to store data so that we can then use one and the same data in different parts of our code, possibly also multiple times. Now, variables are called variables because we can change the values stored in a variable. We can overwrite the value stored in a variable with a new one. If I created a variable with the let keyword, then I can overwrite the value stored in that variable with a brand new value if I want to. And therefore, thus far in this course, where we only learned about these kinds of variables, we only worked with such true variables which could really change. Now, often in development though, you also deal with so-called constant values. So values which you store in a variable once, but which you then never change. So variables where the value actually never changes are called constants. And therefore the name variable is a bit strange because they're not really variable, but variable is a general term in programming describing these data containers, and therefore in JavaScript we also call constants variables. Now constants are created with the const keyword, and up to this point we haven't seen them yet. We haven't worked with them yet, and that's going to change, and therefore I'll now show you why we might want to use constants in certain scenarios and how we use them. Now, what's the idea behind constants? First of all, it's an alternative to using the let keyword and to create a variable that can be changed. But the idea is simple. Sometimes you have variables, data containers, that contain a value which you actually never replace with a new value. So you might have some entered username which you fetched from some input field, and maybe that never changes once you fetched it. So once the form was submitted maybe. In that case, you can store it in a variable, but you can also mark it as a const with that const keyword to make it very clear to you and to other developers that this variable will actually never hold any other value than the one that was initially assigned. And if you would try to assign another value, as you're seeing it here in this little demo snippet I prepared, then you would get an error if this code would be executed, because you would be violating your own rules or your own rule, which says that this variable, username, must not be overwritten with a new value. And that can add extra code safety and ensure that the code is not changed in a way that breaks your program. That might not matter too much in small demos or small projects, but in bigger projects and bigger scripts where maybe multiple developers are working on the same code, this can add extra safety which avoids unwanted errors. And because of that, it is typically considered a good practice as a developer to be explicit in cases where you can be explicit about your intentions of your code. And if you know that some variable will never hold any other value than the initial value, whilst you can keep it as a variable, it is a good idea to turn it into a constant instead, to make that very clear that this variable will never receive a new value. And we can apply this to this demo project we worked on thus far. If we have a look at our demo code here, there is indeed one thing you maybe recognize or see. And that's the fact that all the variables I am creating here never change. None of these variables change. I create two variables here, and I assign values initially, and then I never assign a new value thereafter. And the same is true for all other variables. And therefore we can, and that's important, we don't have to, but we can turn them all into constants by replacing let with const. And the advantage we get from that is that we make it clear that these values should never change. So that's what we can do. And I did mention at the beginning of this course section that as a developer, we sometimes want to be very strict and we want to ensure that our code is not getting used incorrectly, either by us or by other developers. And here I actually have a good example for this, why it might be a good idea to use a couple of constants here. Take these element variables, or constants now, up there. Actually, these variables, as they were before, should never receive new values because our other code relies on the fact that in this product name input element, we have that input element as a value because we want to add an event listener to that and because we, for example, want to extract the max length from that. So if we would leave that as a variable, we theoretically could write code where we overwrite the value stored in this variable with a different value, maybe with a different HTML element, and all of a sudden our other code that depends on this being the initial value, the product name input field, would break. And of course that is kind of a made up scenario here because this is a very short and simple script and we are the only developer working on this. But as you get more experienced and as you start building more complex websites, it will not be unusual that you have longer scripts and that you maybe work on them in a team. And if you then start overriding some variable that one of your colleagues needs with a different value because you think it doesn't matter, for example, all of a sudden some other code breaks. That's why it's optional here in the end, because this is simple, but why it generally is considered a good practice to use constants if you can be that explicit and if you never plan on changing that value, because then you can lock that in and ensure that it never changes. But when I do that, there are a couple of parts in that code that could be confusing. For example, I'm creating constants here in this function, but wait a second, can't this function execute more than once? It executes for every keystroke, so technically these variables do change with every keystroke, right? Well, not really. This function executes with every keystroke, that is correct, but once it's done executing, all the variables that were created during the execution and that are stored in memory, because that is where the variables are stored. They are stored in your computer memory. All those variables are thrown away. Not what you see on the page, and not any changes that were maybe made by your function, but the variables which are stored in memory are thrown away and deleted once this execution finishes. That means that when the function executes the next time for another keystroke, brand new variables are created. Yes, they have the same name as before, but they occupy new parts of your computer memory because the old ones were deleted. So technically, we don't change existing variables, we always create new ones. And therefore, during the function execution, they are constant because thereafter they are deleted. They are never overwritten. Now, another confusing thing could be that we do change some of the elements that are stored in constants. For example, on remaining char's element, which is this constant here, I am changing the text content. Or on product name input element, I am adding an event listener. So clearly I am changing the objects stored in these constants. And that is correct. I am changing these objects. I am changing these DOM elements, for example, but I'm still not changing the constants, the data containers. It is super important to understand that the value stored in a constant, in this case here, is the entire HTML element object. In this case, the object representing the input. Now, I would only change the constant itself if I reassign a value with an equal sign, not to some property of the object, but to the constant itself. So if I would reach out to my remaining chars element and I tried assigning a new value like this, then I would try to change the constant. If I instead change the value of some property in there, then the constant stays the same. It's just the object stored in the constant where some of its properties change. The object itself is the same as before, just some of its properties changed, but the object stored in the constant, and therefore the value of the constant itself overall was not overwritten. And that can definitely be confusing, but it's essentially just important to keep in mind that values inside of an object are just that, values in an object, not the value stored directly in a constant. The value stored in a constant is just the object. And as long as we don't override that with a brand new object and we try to assign a new value to that constant with the equal character again, as long as we don't do that, the constant didn't change. If that's still a bit confusing, it is something that will become clearer with more practice and the deeper you dive into JavaScript. Here we are still only scratching the surface, we are still only getting started with it. Nonetheless, I wanted to touch on this concept and I wanted to bring back constants because it is quite common to use as many constants as possible to make it very clear whether some variable in your code will eventually be overwritten with a new value or whether it is constant and does never change.